Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Beatrice Vance laughed as she poured the vintage Cabernet over Elena Vance's hand-sewn linen dress in front of the entire gala committee. The liquid didn't just splash. It bloomed across the cream-colored fabric like a violent, spreading bruise. The chatter in the vineyard's grand ballroom died instantly, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic clink of 100 crystal glasses being lowered in unison. Elena didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, feeling the cold, heavy moisture seep through the layers of her dress and cling to her skin. The scent of the starched linens and the cloying, metallic fragrance of the lilies on the tables was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, fermented tang of the red wine. "Oh, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice a theatrical trill that carried to the very back of the room. She didn't look sorry. She looked invigorated, her eyes bright with the kind of polished cruelty that only decades of unchecked wealth could produce. "You always did have a penchant for looking like the help. I thought a bit of our finest reserve might at least make you smell like you belong at a Vance event." A few people near the head table chuckled, the kind of nervous, sycophantic laughter that Beatrice required as tribute. Julian Vance, standing just behind his mother, adjusted his gold cufflinks and smirked. He didn't offer a napkin. He simply watched his sister's humiliation with the casual interest of a man watching an ant struggle under a magnifying glass. "It was a 40-hour stitch," Elena said quietly. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling hands of the committee members seated nearby. "And it was 40 hours wasted on a peasant's hobby," her mother snapped, the mask of the grieving widow slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the shark beneath. She turned her back on her daughter, addressing the donors with a graceful wave of her hand. "Please, excuse the interruption. My daughter spends so much time in the dirt with the pickers that she's forgotten the basic etiquette of a ballroom. She's more comfortable in the shadows of the cellar than the light of the sun." Elena looked at the witnesses. There were 3 prominent board members, men who had known her father, men who knew that Elena was the one who actually understood the soil, the chemistry, and the back-breaking labor that kept the Vance name on the world's most expensive bottles. They looked away, their gazes suddenly fixed on their plates. Marcus Thorne, the family's long-standing attorney, was the only one who didn't blink. He sat at the end of the table, his fingers steepled. He saw the stain. He saw the smirk on Julian's face. And most importantly, he saw the way Elena's eyes hadn't filled with tears, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Mother," Julian drawled, stepping forward to refill Beatrice's glass. "Don't be too hard on her. Not everyone is born for the velvet. Some people are just born to be the footstool." He leaned in as he passed Elena, his voice a low, oily whisper that only she could hear. "Go wash up in the kitchen, Elle. It's where you've always belonged anyway. Don't come back out. You're bringing down the property value of the front row." Elena felt the jagged edge of the brass key in her hidden pocket. It was an old, heavy thing, pressed into her palm earlier that morning by Aunt Martha. Her aunt had been the only one to visit her in the small cottage on the edge of the estate, whispering about a waking coma, and a legacy that didn't belong to the woman currently holding court in the ballroom. For years, Elena had played the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter. She had fixed the ledgers Julian ruined. She had saved the harvests Beatrice nearly lost through sheer vanity. She had stayed quiet because she thought loyalty was a shield. She was wrong. Loyalty was a shroud. She looked at her mother's silk scarf, a shimmering piece of Dior that fluttered like a flag of conquest as she bragged to a senator about her vineyard. The woman was a parasite draped in the labor of others, convinced that the blood in her veins was the only thing that mattered. "I'll go," Elena said, her voice cutting through her mother's anecdote. Beatrice didn't even turn around. She just flicked a dismissive hand. "Finally, a sensible decision. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, dear. It's antique." Elena walked toward the exit, the wet fabric of her dress heavy against her legs. She could feel the eyes of the elite on her back, the whispers starting up like the hum of locusts the moment she cleared the threshold. She didn't head for the kitchen. She didn't head for her cottage to cry. Instead, she stepped out into the cool night air of the vineyard. The smell of damp earth and ripening grapes rose to meet her, a familiar, honest scent that didn't require a designer label to be valid. She pulled her phone from her clutch and tapped a message to Marcus Thorne, who she knew was watching his screen under the table. "Open the 1994 trust file," she wrote. "The one my father told you never to show her unless she drew blood." She just did. She looked back at the glowing windows of the ballroom, where the silhouettes of her mother and brother were toasted by a room full of people who didn't realize they were celebrating a funeral. Elena touched the brass key in her pocket and felt the first spark of a fire that would soon consume everything Beatrice Vance thought she owned. The sleeping lion wasn't just awake, it was hungry. The next morning, the Vance estate smelled of expensive espresso and the lingering, suffocating scent of Beatrice's heavy floral perfume. Elena sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped ceramic mug she'd brought from her cottage. It stood in stark contrast to the gold-rimmed bone china Julian was currently using to catch the crumbs of his imported pastries. Beatrice Vance swept into the room, her silk robe trailing behind her like a royal shroud. She didn't look at her daughter. Instead, she adjusted a single white lily in a crystal vase, her movements sharp and performative. "Julian, darling," she said, her voice like honey poured over glass. "The guest list for the heritage auction is finalized. We've secured the front row for the governors." "And Elena?" Julian asked, his voice thick with a smirk. He didn't look up from his phone, his thumb flicking through photos of Italian sports cars. "Is she going to sit in the back with the catering staff? She certainly has the wardrobe for it." Elena felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, but she kept her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her coffee. She thought of the brass key in her pocket, the cold weight of it against her thigh. "I'll be there," she said quietly. "Oh, I don't think so," Beatrice snapped, finally turning her icy blue eyes toward her daughter. "That sun-damaged skin and those calloused hands. You're a reminder of the dirt, Elena. We are trying to sell a lifestyle of elegance, not the grit of the labor that produces it. You'll stay at the cottage. Consider it a paid vacation from your little hobby in the vineyard." The insult was a familiar blade, but today it didn't draw blood. Elena watched as Julian laughed, the sound wet and entitled. He reached for a crystal carafe of orange juice, his movements careless. "By the way, sis," he said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "I've decided to clear out the north slope. Those organic vines are a drain on the quarterly projections. I've already signed the contract to have them ripped out on Monday. We're putting in a helipad for the VIP guests." The north slope, her father's last project. The vines she had spent 5 years nursing back to health with her own 2 hands. Elena's pulse hammered against her throat, a frantic rhythm of rage. She looked at her brother, seeing the vacancy in his eyes, the absolute lack of respect for the land that fed his greed. "You can't do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I already did," Julian replied, flashing a grin that showed too much teeth. "Mother gave me the power of attorney over the agricultural assets yesterday. You're just the help now, Elena. Try to remember your place." Beatrice Vance nodded in approval, her expression one of serene cruelty. "It's for the best, dear. You've always been too attached to the mud. It's time you learned that in this family we don't work the land. We own it." Elena stood up, the chair legs scraping harshly against the marble floor, a jagged sound that made Beatrice wince. She didn't argue. She didn't plead for the vines or her father's memory. She simply walked toward the door, her hand slipping into her pocket to grip the key. As she passed the hallway mirror, she caught sight of herself. She looked tired, her clothes simple and worn, but her eyes were different. The fire she'd felt the night before hadn't gone out. It had settled into a steady, white-hot glow. Her phone buzzed in her palm. A text from Marcus Thorne. "The 1994 trust isn't a bank account, Elena. It's a deed of absolute reversion. If they attempt to sell or alter the North Slope, the entire estate triggers a mandatory transfer. They've walked straight into the trap." Elena stopped at the threshold of the sunroom, looking back at her mother and brother. They were laughing now, toasted by the morning sun, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath their feet was already beginning to shift. Monday, Elena murmured to herself. The auction was in 48 hours. The North Slope was scheduled for destruction in 72. She had exactly 2 days to ensure that when the first bulldozer arrived, Beatrice Vance would be the one standing on the outside of the gates, looking in. 2 days later, the air in the valley was thick with the scent of impending rain and wood smoke. Elena Vance stood in the hushed, mahogany-lined sanctuary of the law offices of Thorne and Associates, her boots feeling heavy and out of place on the plush Persian rug. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper, a sterile contrast to the wild, sun-drenched rose of the North Slope. Marcus Thorne sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single, ancient oak. He didn't offer a smile. He simply slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the polished surface. It's the original 1994 trust instrument, Elena. Your grandfather didn't just leave you the land, he left you a fail-safe. He knew your mother's appetite for status would eventually outweigh her respect for the soil. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cool, thick paper. And the reversion clause? It's ironclad, he replied, his voice a low, rhythmic baritone. The moment a sale is finalized or the agricultural integrity of the North Slope is compromised, the entire Vance estate, the house, the winery, the holdings, reverts to the primary beneficiary of the 1994 trust. That's you. Beatrice has spent 20 years treating this place like her personal piggy bank, never realizing she was merely a tenant at will. Elena tucked the envelope into her bag, the weight of it feeling like a loaded weapon. She thinks the auction tomorrow is her coronation. She's already invited the Sterling family over tonight to celebrate the liquidation of dead assets. Then let her celebrate, he said, a ghost of a grim smile appearing on his face. Arrogance is a loud mask, but it doesn't change the law. When she arrived back at the estate an hour later, the sound of a popping cork echoed off the stone walls of the terrace. Beatrice Vance was draped in a silk caftan that cost more than a year's worth of irrigation equipment, her laughter sharp and performative. Beside her, Julian Vance was already on his second glass of the private reserve, his feet propped up on a hand-carved limestone table. "Oh, look, the prodigal laborer has returned," Julian said, his voice thick with a mocking drawl. He swirled the wine, a vintage Elena had spent 3 years perfecting, and dumped the last inch of the glass onto the flagstones. "You should probably start packing your shears, Elena. The developers are bringing the heavy machinery in on Tuesday. They said the old vines are just clutter for the new resort footprint." Beatrice didn't even look up from the seating chart she was meticulously editing. Her diamond tennis bracelet clattered against the table, a cold, rhythmic sound that grated on Elena's nerves. "Don't be cruel, Julian. She can stay on as a consultant for the landscaping if she behaves herself. Though, Elena, do try to use the back entrance. The Sterlings will be here in an hour, and you smell quite strongly of the stables." "I was in the vineyard, Mother," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "Checking the health of the vines you're planning to rip out." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes like chips of blue ice. "They are vines, Elena, not children. You've always had this tiresome habit of sentimentalizing dirt. Tomorrow, that dirt becomes a legacy of actual value. I've spent 30 years maintaining this family's standing while your father let the accounts wither. I am finally fixing his mistakes." "Mistakes?" Elena stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the table. "He built this brand. He cared about the legacy." "Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this auction? Once the gavel falls, there's no going back. The past has a way of reclaiming what belongs to it." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter. "Listen to her. She sounds like a Gothic novel. Go wash up, sister. You're depressing the help." Beatrice waved a hand in a dismissive gesture, already turning back to her seating chart. "The papers are signed, the buyers are vetted, and the bank is satisfied. Your warnings are just the desperate reaching of someone who has realized they've lost. Now go, and wear something that doesn't scream poverty. I won't have you embarrassing me in front of the Sterlings." Elena turned without a word, her hand resting on the strap of her bag where the deed lay hidden. She walked through the grand foyer, past the portraits of ancestors who had actually bled for this land, and up to her room. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. From her window, she watched the first of the luxury SUVs pull up the long, winding driveway. The Sterlings had arrived. She could hear her mother's high-pitched, welcoming trill from the driveway, the sound of a woman who believed she had already won the war. Elena pulled a simple, charcoal-gray dress from her closet, the one she'd bought with her own savings, far away from her mother's influence. She looked at her reflection, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a cold, steady light. She picked up her phone and sent a short text to Marcus. "The party has started. See you at the courthouse at 10 sharp." Downstairs, the clinking of crystal and the hum of elite gossip drifted up the vents. They were toasting to the destruction of the North Slope. They were laughing at the sentimental girl who didn't understand the power of $1. Elena smoothed the fabric of her dress and picked up the cream envelope. She didn't need diamonds to feel powerful tonight. She held the legal death warrant of her mother's ambitions in her hand. "Drink up, Julian," she whispered to the darkening room. "It's the most expensive glass of wine you'll ever have." The countdown had reached its final 24 hours. Tomorrow, the auction wouldn't be a sale, it would be an execution. And for the first time in her life, Elena was the one holding the blade. The morning before the auction, the air in the Vance estate tasted like a funeral. Elena Vance stood in the center of the barrel room, the atmosphere thick with the scent of damp oak and the sharp, sweet tang of fermenting grapes. She traced the rim of a crystal glass, her reflection distorted in the dark liquid. This was the heart of the North Slope, the legacy her mother was preparing to butcher for a quick infusion of cash. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the rhythmic, predatory click of designer heels echoed against the stone floor. Beatrice Vance marched in, her silk suit the color of a fresh bruise. She didn't look at the rows of aging wine or the craftsmanship of the barrels. She looked at Elena with the clinical detachment of a debt collector. "The caterers are complaining about the humidity in here," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "I told them it doesn't matter. By this time tomorrow, this sentimental rot will be someone else's problem. I want the private cellar keys, Elena. Julian needs to select the vintages for his victory toast tonight." Elena didn't turn around. She felt the cool weight of the cream envelope tucked into her inner pocket. The legal leverage Marcus Thorne had finalized just an hour ago. "Julian hasn't won anything yet, Mother, and the private cellar is part of the estate's protected assets. It's not a personal liquor cabinet for his friends." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, cold sound that bounced off the vats. She stepped closer, the cloying, artificial scent of her lily perfume overwhelming the natural aroma of the vineyard. "You still don't get it, do you? You're playing at being a guardian, but you're just a squatter in a house I've already sold. I've spent 20 years maintaining the illusion of your father's passion project. Now I'm cashing in. Give me the keys, or I'll have the locks cut and the cost deducted from whatever pittance of an inheritance I decide to leave you." Elena finally turned, her gaze steady. She saw the lines of greed around her mother's eyes, the way she adjusted her diamond-encrusted watch with the casual confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. "You should be careful what you celebrate," Elena said softly. "Sometimes the most expensive glass of wine is the one you can't actually afford to drink. Markets fluctuate, and so does loyalty. Are you sure you know who's really holding the gavel tomorrow?" Beatrice sneered, waving a manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. "Your cryptic little warnings are as pathetic as your bank account. You've always been dramatic, Elena. It's why you're an architect of empty spaces, while I'm the architect of this family's survival. Julian is the future. You're just the help we forgot to fire." She turned on her heel, the sound of her departure a sharp staccato against the silence. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't think she needed to. In her mind, the board was set, and Elena was a pawn already removed from the game. Left alone in the dim light, Elena pulled out her phone. A single message sat on the screen from Marcus. The injunction is signed. The ownership transfer for the North Slope's primary water rights has been flagged as fraudulent. She's walking into a trap. Elena walked to the far end of the room and pressed her hand against the rough, cool stone of the original foundation. She could almost feel the pulse of the land, the history Beatrice was so eager to erase. Outside, she heard the roar of Julian's sports car as he tore down the driveway, likely headed to the city to brag about a fortune he hadn't earned. They were so blinded by the glitter of the coming sale that they couldn't see the shadow of the noose. Beatrice thought she was selling a property. She didn't realize she was signing a confession. Elena checked her watch. 20 hours remained. She picked up the crystal glass and poured the wine back into the barrel. "Keep your toast, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. "You're going to need the breath for the explanation you'll owe the authorities." The countdown had reached its final stage. Tomorrow, the elite of the valley would gather to witness a sale, but Elena was bringing an execution. She adjusted her coat, feeling the crisp paper of the deed against her ribs. The golden child and the controller were about to find out that, when you build a house on lies, the foundation doesn't just crack, it swallows you whole. The evening arrived with a heavy, golden humidity that clung to the Vance estate like a premonition. By 7 o'clock, the driveway was a parade of obsidian-black SUVs and vintage sports cars, their headlights cutting through the rising mist of the valley. Inside the grand ballroom, the scent of expensive lilies mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. It was a sensory trap, a layer of floral sweetness designed to mask the rot beneath the floorboards. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost in her own home. She had chosen a dress of midnight silk, a stark contrast to the shimmering, pale gold gown her mother wore. Beatrice was already at the center of the room, holding court near the fireplace. She looked every bit the grieving but resilient matriarch, her laughter tinkling like breaking glass as she leaned toward the Sinclair brothers, the primary investors for the evening. "It's a bittersweet night," Beatrice said, her voice carrying perfectly to the surrounding witnesses. She placed a delicate hand on the arm of the elder Sinclair. "To see the legacy my late husband built pass into such capable hands, it's what he would have wanted. My daughter, of course, finds the transition difficult. She's always been more comfortable with blueprints than with the reality of business." Elena felt the first sharp spike of rage. It wasn't just the lie. It was the practiced ease with which her mother dismissed her entire career in front of the valley's elite. She saw Judge Miller and Mrs. Sterling exchange a pitying look. To them, Elena was merely the temperamental architect, the daughter who couldn't quite fill the shoes of the Vance name. "There she is now," Julian said, appearing at his mother's side. He looked flushed, his tie slightly loosened, the unmistakable smell of expensive bourbon trailing him. He didn't offer Elena a greeting. Instead, he smirked at the investors. "Don't mind the gloom, gentlemen. Elena is just mourning the loss of her playground. She spent years trying to turn this place into a museum of modern art. Luckily, Mother and I know that a vineyard is for profit, not for vanity projects." The investors laughed, a low, rumbling sound that felt like a physical weight against Elena's chest. Julian reached out and patted her shoulder, a condescending gesture that made her skin crawl. "Why don't you go find Martha, Elle? I think she needs help with the hors d'oeuvres. It'll give you something useful to do with your hands." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her clutch and felt the sharp, cold corner of the legal envelope. The texture of the heavy paper was a grounding wire, a secret power that hummed against her fingertips. She looked Julian directly in the eye, her expression unreadable. "I'll check on the catering," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "But you should be careful with that vintage, Julian. It's a 2014. It has a tendency to turn bitter if it's handled by someone who doesn't understand the foundation." She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him blinking in confusion. She found Marcus Thorne standing near the tall French doors that led to the terrace. The lawyer looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his eyes scanning the room with a professional's wariness. When he saw Elena, he gave a single, imperceptible nod. The trap was set. Every witness they needed, The judge, the investors, the press, and the extended family was currently trapped in a room fueled by Beatrice's vanity. "The documents are verified," Marcus whispered as she passed. "The notary is on standby. Once the public announcement is made, there is no going back. Are you sure about this, Elena? This will destroy her reputation permanently." "She destroyed her own reputation the moment she forged the signatures," she replied, her gaze fixed on her mother. "I'm just providing the audience." Elena moved toward the back of the room, passing Aunt Martha, who was directing the staff with a grim set to her jaw. Martha caught Elena's hand for a brief second, her fingers squeezing tight. "The truth is a heavy thing, Elena," she murmured. "Make sure you're ready for the splash when it hits the water." "I've been underwater for years, Aunt Martha," she said. "It's time for everyone else to learn how to swim." The atmosphere in the room began to shift as the clock neared 8. The wait-for-it moment had arrived. The hum of the string quartet died down, and the house lights dimmed slightly, directing everyone's attention to the small podium at the head of the room. Beatrice moved toward it with the grace of a queen ascending a throne, her diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers. Julian followed her, preening, already looking like a man who had come into a fortune he hadn't earned. Beatrice tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the ballroom. The witnesses, at least 50 of the most influential people in the county, fell silent. The Sinclair brothers stepped forward, pens ready, the sale contract laid out on a mahogany table that had belonged to Elena's father. "Friends, family, and honored guests," Beatrice began, her voice trembling with a well-rehearsed emotion. "Tonight, we close one chapter of the Vance story and begin another. This vineyard has been my life's work since my husband passed. It is my heart. But for the sake of the future, and for the sake of my son's vision, I am proud to sign over the stewardship of this land." She picked up the gold-plated pen. Julian beamed, looking out at the crowd with an insufferable, predatory triumph. He caught Elena's eye in the back of the room and winked, a final, silent insult. Elena stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She simply began to walk down the center of the room, the sound of her heels clicking against the oak floors like a ticking clock. Every head turned. The investors paused. Beatrice's hand froze inches above the paper, her eyes narrowing as she watched her daughter approach. "Mother," Elena said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the expectant silence. "Before you sign away a legacy that isn't yours to sell, I think there's a small matter of the deed that the Sinclair brothers really ought to see." The room went deathly still. Beatrice's face paled, the mask of the grieving widow slipping just enough to reveal the jagged panic beneath. Elena reached the front of the room and laid the heavy envelope on top of the contract. "Wait for it," Elena whispered, loud enough only for her mother and brother to hear. The countdown had hit 0. The clock on the mantel ticked once, a sharp, metallic strike that seemed to echo in the sudden vacuum of the drawing room. Elena didn't move. She kept her hand flat on the heavy envelope, feeling the textured grain of the parchment beneath her palm. Across the mahogany table, Beatrice's fingers were still hovering over the contract, the gold fountain pen trembling just inches from the signature line. "What is this, Elena?" Beatrice's voice was a brittle whisper, stripped of its usual velvet authority. She tried to force a laugh, a dry, hacking sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Some childhood drawing, a letter to your father. This is a business meeting. Don't be absurd." "It's the original deed of trust for the Vance estate," Elena interrupted. Her voice was low, steady, and utterly devoid of warmth. She slid the document out of the envelope. The wax seal was unbroken, a deep crimson mark of a promise made years ago. The one father had Marcus Thorne draft 6 months before the accident. The one you told the board was lost in the office fire. Julian Vance let out a sharp, nervous breath. He reached for his scotch, his hand shaking so violently the ice rattled against the crystal. "The fire? Elena, you're talking nonsense. Everything was settled. Mother has the rights to the inheritance. We all agreed." "She has the rights to the house, Julian," Elena said, not looking at him. Her gaze was locked on her mother. "But the vineyard, the land, and the Sinclair partnership, those were placed in a blind trust. A trust that only dissolves upon my 31st birthday, or, she paused, the irony tasting like vintage wine, upon an attempted sale of the assets by a third party without my written consent. The room seemed to tilt. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from the shadows near the bookshelves. He looked at Beatrice, his expression a mix of professional coldness and long-overdue justice. "I've reviewed the documents, Beatrice. Elena is correct. Your signature on this contract with the Sinclair brothers wouldn't just be void. It would be a public confession of attempted fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. The Sinclair brothers, two men who valued legacy and reputation above all else, stood in unison. The elder brother, Thomas, looked at Beatrice with a sneer of pure revulsion. "You were going to sell a stolen property? You were going to tether our family name to a felony?" Beatrice's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of curdled cream. Her carefully painted lips parted, trembling as she tried to form a protest that died in her throat. The fine lines around her eyes, usually hidden by expensive serums, deepened into jagged canyons of panic. She looked older, suddenly, the mask of the grieving but dignified widow shattering like dropped porcelain. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found only the cold, hard stares of the men she had tried to swindle. She looked like a cornered animal, her chest heaving under the weight of her silk blouse, her posture slumping as the reality of her exposure settled into her bones. "I did it for the family," she rasped, her hand clutching at the pearls at her throat. "Julian's debts, the lifestyle we worked so hard to maintain. You did it for yourself," Aunt Martha said from her wingback chair by the fire. She didn't stand, but her presence filled the room. "You always did, Beatrice. You thought Elena was too weak to look for the truth. You thought I was too old to remember where your husband kept his secrets." Elena didn't stay to hear her mother's excuses. She had spent a lifetime listening to them. She leaned over the table, her shadow falling across the useless contract. "You once told me I was a guest in this house, Mother. It turns out you're the one who needs to start packing." She turned on her heel. The sound of her heels clicking against the oak floor was the only rhythm in the room as she walked toward the double doors. She felt the weight of the last 5 years falling away, replaced by a cold, clear sense of victory. "Elena!" Julian called out, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who realized his allowance had just vanished. "Wait, what about my—" She didn't look back. She stepped out into the cool night air of the veranda, the scent of damp earth and ripening grapes filling her lungs. Behind her, the shouting was finally starting. The investors were demanding their legal fees. The Sinclair brothers were calling their attorneys. The Vance dynasty was crumbling, and for the first time in her life, Elena was the one holding the hammer. As she walked toward her car, she pulled her phone from her pocket and made one final call. "Marcus," she said as the lawyer answered. "Start the eviction papers. I want her out by Monday." The silence that followed the collapse of the Vance Gala was heavier than the music had ever been. 2 hours after the final investor had fled the vineyard, the grand study of the Vance estate felt like a tomb. Beatrice Vance sat behind the mahogany desk, her fingers white-pivoted as she gripped a landline receiver that had been dead for 20 minutes. The power hadn't been cut, but the social cord certainly had. Across from her, Julian paced the length of the Persian rug, his silk tie loosened, and his face flushed with the frantic energy of a man watching his gilded cage dissolve into rust. "The bank isn't picking up," Beatrice hissed, slamming the receiver back into its cradle. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, sharp and final. "They can't just freeze the primary accounts based on the word of a disgruntled girl. I built this name. I am the Vance legacy." "Mother, she didn't just use words," Julian snapped, his voice cracking. He stopped pacing to stare at the empty crystal decanter on the sideboard. "She used the original deed. She used the audit trails you thought were buried in the 2018 tax filings. The investors aren't just leaving, they're talking to the district attorney." The heavy oak doors of the study swung open without a knock. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his expression as neutral as the legal briefs tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a man who had worked for the family for 2 decades. He looked like an undertaker. He was followed closely by Aunt Martha, whose face bore a look of somber resolution that Beatrice had never seen before. "Get out, Marcus," Beatrice commanded, rising to her feet. She tried to summon the old authority, the cold steel that had kept the county in her palm for years. "You're fired. I'll have your license for what you did tonight." "Actually, Beatrice, I resigned 3 hours ago," Marcus said calmly. He placed a single, thick envelope on the desk. "And I'm not here as your counsel. I'm here as the representative for the majority shareholder of the Vance estate and all subsidiary holdings." Beatrice Vance looked at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. As she reached out to slide the document toward her, the light from the chandelier caught the tremor in her hand. She tore the seal, her eyes scanning the first page. The transformation was visceral. The skin around her eyes tightened, then sagged, a map of wrinkles she'd spent thousands to hide suddenly appearing in the harsh overhead light. Her jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, her lips trembling as the carefully applied mahogany lipstick smeared against her teeth. The regal mask she had worn for 40 years didn't just crack, it disintegrated, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out expression of a woman who had finally run out of people to threaten. Her pupils shrunk to pinpricks, darting frantically as if searching for a loophole in the air itself, while a frantic pulse throbbed visibly in her neck, mocking her attempts to remain composed. "This is a mistake," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "She can't evict me. This is my home. My husband's father built these walls." "And your husband's father left the fallback clause to the blood of the labor," Aunt Martha said, her voice steady and devoid of the usual softness. "You spent 20 years treating Elena like a servant in her own house, Beatrice. You forgot that the foundations of this place were never built on your social standing. They were built on the wine, and Elena is the only one who ever truly touched the soil. Julian, do something." Beatrice turned to her son, her voice rising to a shrill peak. Julian Vance didn't move. He was looking at Marcus, his eyes wide with a different kind of terror. "What about my trust? The quarterly payout was due on Friday." "The trust was collateralized against the vineyard's expansion debt," Marcus replied, his voice devoid of pity. "Since the expansion was based on fraudulent valuations provided by your mother, the trust has been dissolved to cover the initial litigation fees. You have your personal effects, Julian, nothing more." The sound of heels clicking on the marble foyer signaled the arrival of the new owner. Elena Vance stepped into the room, wearing the same simple dress she'd worn to the gala, but she seemed to occupy more space than she ever had before. She didn't look angry. She looked finished. "Elena, darling," Beatrice started, her voice a terrifying mimicry of her old, manipulative charm. She stepped around the desk, reaching out a hand. "We can fix this. A family meeting. We'll sit down, we'll restructure." "There is no we, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice as cold as the wind off the northern slopes. She didn't flinch as her mother approached. "And there is no family left in this room for you to manage. You spent my entire life telling me that I was a guest here, a burden that had to earn its keep. You told me that the Vance name was a crown I wasn't fit to wear." Elena walked to the window, looking out at the rows of vines stretching into the darkness. The scent of damp earth and ripening grapes drifted through the partially open glass, a reminder of the work that had actually sustained them. "I've spent the last 5 years documenting every cent you funneled into your private offshore accounts," Elena continued, turning back to face the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to break her. "I've watched you gaslight Martha and belittle the men who actually harvest the fruit. You didn't love this legacy. You loved the power it gave you to look down on everyone else. You're throwing your own mother onto the street." Beatrice spat, the charm finally failing, replaced by a raw, ugly desperation. "I'm giving you exactly what you gave me when I was 18 and asking for tuition," Elena replied. "A suitcase and the realization that the world doesn't owe you a thing. Marcus has the inventory list. Anything not on it stays. The movers will be here at 8 o'clock Monday morning. I suggest you start with the jewelry you bought with the vineyard's payroll tax." Beatrice slumped back into the chair, the weight of her own history finally crushing her. She looked small. For the first time, the grand study made her look like an intruder. Elena turned to Marcus. "Is the transition of the production facility complete?" "The locks were changed an hour ago," Marcus confirmed. "The staff has already been notified. They're quite relieved, actually." Elena nodded, then looked at Julian, who was staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. She felt a flicker of the old protective instinct, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of every time he'd laughed while Beatrice mocked her. "Goodbye, Julian," Elena said softly. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the study, the sound of her footsteps fading as she crossed the foyer toward the front door. She didn't look back at the portraits of the ancestors on the walls. She didn't need their approval anymore. As she stepped out onto the porch, the night air felt clean. Behind her, in the silent house, the grandfather clock struck the hour. It was the only thing left in the Vance estate that still kept Beatrice's time, and even its rhythm was beginning to slow. Elena reached her car and paused, looking up at the darkened windows of the master suite. She pulled a single brass key from her pocket, the key to the cellar where the oldest vintages were kept, and felt its cold weight. The reckoning was over, but the silence of the aftermath was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the Vance estate had clicked shut behind Elena Vance, a sound that had echoed like a gavel in the stillness of the night. Today, the air smelled of salt spray and ripening grapes, a sharp, clean contrast to the cloying scent of lilies that had always defined her mother's hallways. Elena stood on the gravel path of her own vineyard, a modest but thriving stretch of land on the coast that she had purchased with the inheritance Beatrice Vance had tried so desperately to bury. Marcus Thorne walked toward her, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. He didn't look like the weary, compromised man she had first met in her mother's study. He looked younger, his gait lighter. He stopped beside her, squinting against the bright morning sun. "The final audit is complete," he said, handing her a single, crisp sheet of paper. "The main estate has been sold to a historical trust. It will be a museum by next spring. No more private galas, no more closed-door deals, just school tour and plaque-reading tourists." Elena took the paper, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy bond. She felt a quiet surge of triumph. Beatrice had spent her entire life treating that house like a fortress of social standing. Now it was public property. The Vance legacy was being preserved as a relic of a bygone era, not a living dynasty. "And my mother?" she asked, her voice steady. "She's settled into the apartment in the city," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. "It's a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor. No doorman. Julian Vance is living with her, though from what I hear, the arrangement is strained. He's working as a junior clerk for a title company. It's a 40-hour week, and he's discovering for the first time that his name doesn't entitle him to a corner office." Elena looked out over the vines. She could almost see it, her mother sitting in a cramped living room, surrounded by the few pieces of Louis XIV furniture that had fit through the narrow door, watching the dust motes dance in the light of a window that faced an alley instead of a manicured lawn. The image didn't bring her joy, but it brought a profound sense of balance. The scales, so long tipped by Beatrice's cruelty, had finally leveled. Later that afternoon, Elena drove into the city. She had a final meeting at a small cafe near the park, a place where the elite didn't go. Martha Vance was already there, tucked into a corner booth with a cup of herbal tea. When she saw Elena, her eyes crinkled with a warmth that had been absent for years. "You look different," Martha said, reaching across the table to squeeze Elena's hand. "The shadows are gone." "I feel lighter," Elena admitted. She glanced toward the window. "I saw them, Martha. On the way here, I saw Julian waiting for the bus." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the cost. Julian had been the golden child, the prince of the vineyard, and now he was a man in a cheap suit checking his watch with a look of panicked exhaustion. He hadn't seen her, and she hadn't stopped. "He'll learn," Martha said softly. "Or he won't. But he's living a real life now. That's more than Beatrice ever gave him." The bell above the cafe door chimed, and for a fleeting second, Elena expected to see her mother stride in, draped in silk and dripping with condescension. But the woman who entered was a stranger, a young mother with a laughing child. The ghost of Beatrice Vance no longer haunted every room Elena entered. The cost of her freedom had been the total dissolution of the family she had once tried so hard to save. She was a woman without a mother, a sister to a man who likely hated her, and the owner of a name that had been dragged through the mud of public scandal before being polished clean by the truth. "I'm going to name the first vintage after you," Elena said, looking at Martha. "Not Vance, just Martha's Gold." "I'd like that," the older woman whispered. As Elena left the cafe, she paused on the sidewalk. Across the street, she saw a familiar figure. Beatrice was walking a small, high-strung dog. She was wearing a designer coat, but it was frayed at the cuffs, and she was struggling with a grocery bag that looked too heavy for her. For a moment, their eyes met. The color drained from her mother's face. The arrogance that had once been Beatrice's armor was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic sort of shame. She didn't shout. She didn't demand an apology. She simply looked away, her shoulders stooping as she hurried toward the entrance of a nondescript brick building. Elena didn't feel the urge to help. She didn't feel the old, stinging need for approval. She simply turned and walked toward her car, the sound of her own footsteps firm and rhythmic on the pavement. The reckoning was over, and the new world was waiting. Behind her, the city hummed with a life that no longer belonged to the Vances, and for the first time in 30 years, Elena was perfectly fine with being just herself.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.